Section 19 of Under the Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Part 3, Chapter 3. A Confession. It was a morning of the latter summer-time, a morning of lingering dews, when the grass is never dry in the shade. Fuchsias and dahlias were laden till 11 o'clock with small drops and dashes of water, changing the colour of their sparkle at every movement of the air, and elsewhere hanging on twigs like small silver fruit. The threads of garden spiders appeared thick and polished. In the dry and sunny places, dozens of long-legged crane-flies whizzed off the grass at every step the passer took. Fancy Day and her friend, Susan Dewy, the tranter's daughter, were in such a spot as this, pulling down a bough laden with early apples. 3 months had elapsed since Dick and Fancy had journeyed together from Budmouth, and the course of their love had run on vigorously during the whole time. There had been just enough difficulty attending its development, and just enough finesse required in keeping it private, to lend the passion an ever-increasing freshness on Fancy's part, whilst, whether from these accessories or not, Dick's heart had been at all times as fond as could be desired. But there was a cloud on Fancy's horizon now. "She is so well off, better than any of us," Susan Dewy was saying. "Her father farms 500 acres, and she might marry a doctor or curate or anything of that kind if she contrived a little." "I don't think Dick ought to have gone to that gipsy party at all when he knew I couldn't go," replied Fancy uneasily. "He didn't know that you would not be there till it was too late to refuse the invitation," said Susan. "And what was she like? Tell me." "Well, she was rather pretty, I must own." "Tell straight on about her, can't you? Come, do, Susan. How many times did you say he danced with her?" "Once." "Twice, I think you said." "Indeed, I'm sure I didn't." "Well, and he wanted to again, I expect." "No, I don't think he did. She wanted to dance with him again bad enough, I know. Everybody does with Dick, because he's so handsome and such a clever courter." "Oh, I wish... How did you say she wore her hair?" "In long curls, and her hair is so light, and it curls without being put in paper. That's how it is she's so attractive." "She's trying to get him away. Yes, she is. And through keeping this miserable school I mustn't wear my hair in curls. But I will. I don't care if I leave the school and go home. I will wear my curls. Look, Susan, do. Is her hair as soft and long as this?" Fancy pulled from its coil under her hat a twine of her own hair, and stretched it down her shoulder to show its length, looking at Susan to catch her opinion from her eyes. "It is about the same length as that, I think," said Miss Dewy. Fancy paused hopelessly. "I wish mine was lighter, like hers," she continued mournfully. "But hers isn't so soft, is it? Tell me now." "I don't know." Fancy abstractedly extended her vision to survey a yellow butterfly and a red and black butterfly that were flitting along in company, and then became aware that Dick was advancing up the garden. "Susan, here's Dick coming. I suppose that's because we've been talking about him." "Well then, I shall go indoors now. He won't want me." And Susan turned practically and walked off. Enter the single-minded Dick, whose only fault at the gypsying or picnic had been that of loving Fancy too exclusively, and depriving himself of the innocent pleasure the gathering might have afforded him by sighing regretfully at her absence, who had danced with the rival in sheer despair of ever being able to get through that stale, flat, and unprofitable afternoon in any other way. But this she would not believe. Fancy had settled her plan of emotion. To reproach Dick? Oh, no, no. I am in great trouble, said she, taking what was intended to be a hopelessly melancholy survey of a few small apples lying under the tree, yet a critical ear might have noticed in her voice a tentative tone as to the effect of the words upon Dick when she uttered them. What are ye in trouble about? Tell me of it, said Dick earnestly. Darling, I will share it with 'ee and help 'ee. No, no, you can't. Nobody can. Why not? You don't deserve it, whatever it is. Tell me, dear. Oh, it isn't what you think. It is dreadful. My own sin. Sin, Fancy? As if you could sin. I know it can't be. 'Tis, said the young lady in a pretty little frenzy of sorrow. I have done wrong, and I don't like to tell it. Nobody will forgive me, nobody, and you above all will not. I have allowed myself to What? Not flirt? He said, controlling his emotion as if it were by a sudden pressure inward from his surface. And you said only the day before yesterday that you hadn't flirted in your life. Yes, I did. And that was a wicked story. I have let another love me, and, good God, well, I'll forgive you. Yes, if you couldn't help it, yes, I will, said the now dismal Dick. Did you encourage him? Oh, I don't know. Yes. No. Oh, I think so. Who was it? Tell me. Mr. Shiner. After a silence that was only disturbed by the fall of an apple, a long checked sigh from Dick, and a sob from Fancy, he said with real austerity, Tell it all, every word. He looked at me, and I looked at him, and he said, Will you let me show you how to catch bullfinches down there by the stream? And I wanted to know very much. I did so long to have a bullfinch. I couldn't help that. And I said, yes. And then he said, come here. And I went with him down to the lovely river. And then he said to me, look and see how I do it, and then you'll know. I put this birdline round this twig, and then I go here, he said, and hide away under a bush. And presently clever Mr. Bird comes and perches upon the twig, and flaps his wings, and you've got him before you can say Jack something. Oh, I forget what. Jack Sprat, mournfully suggested Dick through the cloud of his misery. No, not Jack Sprat, she sobbed. Then 'twas Jack Robinson, he said, with the emphasis of a man who had resolved to discover every iota of the truth or die. Yes, that was it. And then I put my hand upon the rail of the bridge to get across, and that's all. Well, that isn't much either, said Dick critically, and more cheerfully, not that I see what business Shiner has to take upon himself to teach you anything. But it do seem there must have been more than that to set you up in such a dreadful taking. He looked into Fancy's eyes. Misery of miseries, guilt was written there still. Now, Fancy, you've not told me all, said Dick rather sternly for a quiet young man. Oh, don't speak so cruelly. I am afraid to tell you now. If you hadn't been harsh, I was going to tell all. Now I can't. Come, dear Fancy, tell, come. I'll forgive, I must. By heaven and earth I must, whether I will or no. I love you so. Well then, when I put my hand on the bridge, he touched it. A scamp, said Dick, grinding an imaginary human frame to powder. And then he looked at me, and at last he said, are you in love with Dick Dewy? And I said, perhaps I am. And then he said, I wish you weren't then, for I want to marry you with all my soul." "There's a villain now! Want to marry you!" And Dick quivered with the bitterness of satirical laughter. Then suddenly remembering that he might have reckoned without his host, "Unless, to be sure, you were willing to have him. Perhaps you are," he said, with the wretched indifference of a castaway. "No, indeed I am not," she said, her sobs just beginning to take a favourable turn towards cure. "Well then," said Dick, coming a little to his senses, "you've been stretching it very much in giving such a dreadful beginning to such a mere nothing, and I know what you've done it for. Just because of that gipsy party." He turned away from her and took 5 paces decisively, as if he were tired of an ungrateful country, including herself. "You did it to make me jealous, and I won't stand it." He flung the words to her over his shoulder and then stalked on, apparently very anxious to walk to the remotest of the colonies that very minute. "Oh, oh, Dick, Dick!" she cried, trotting after him like a pet lamb, and really seriously alarmed at last. "You'll kill me! My impulses are bad, miserably wicked, and I can't help it. Forgive me, Dick, and I love you always. And those times when you look silly and don't seem quite good enough for me, just the same I do, Dick. And there is something more serious, though not concerning that walk with him." "Well, what is it?" Altering his mind about walking to the colonies, in fact passing to the other extreme, and standing so rooted to the road that he was apparently not even going home. "Why, this," she said, drying the beginning of a new flood of tears she had been going to shed. "This is the serious part. Father has told Mr. Shiner that he would like him for a son-in-law if he could get me, that he has his right hearty consent to come courting me." End of section 19. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Under the Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Part 3, Chapter 4. An Arrangement. "That is serious," said Dick, more intellectually than he had spoken for a long time. The truth was that Geoffrey knew nothing about his daughter's continued walks and meetings with Dick. When a hint that there were symptoms of an attachment between them had first reached Geoffrey's ears, he stated so emphatically that he must think the matter over before any such thing could be allowed, that rather unwisely on Dick's part, whatever it might have been on the lady's, the lovers were careful to be seen together no more in public, and Geoffrey, forgetting the report, did not think over the matter at all. So Mr. Shiner resumed his old position in Geoffrey's brain by mere flux of time. Even Shiner began to believe that Dick existed for Fancy no more, though that remarkably easy-going man had taken no active steps on his own account as yet. "And father has not only told Mr. Shiner that," continued Fancy, "but he has written me a letter to say that he should wish me to encourage Mr. Shiner if 'twas convenient." "I must start off and see your father at once," said Dick, taking 2 or 3 vehement steps to the south, recollecting that Mr. Day lived to the north, and coming back again. "I think we had better see him together. Not tell him what you come for or anything of the kind until he likes you, and so win his brain through his heart, which is always the way to manage people. I mean in this way. I'm going home on Saturday week to help them in the honey taking. You might come there to me, have something to eat and drink, and let him guess what your coming signifies, without saying it in so many words." "We'll do it, dearest, but I shall ask him for you, flat and plain, not wait for his guessing." And the lover then stepped close to her and attempted to give her one little kiss on the cheek, his lips lighting, however, on the outlying tract of her back hair by reason of an impulse that had caused her to turn her head with a jerk. "Yes, and I'll put on my second best suit and a clean shirt and collar, and black my boots as if 'twas a Sunday. 'Twill have a good appearance, you see, and that's a great deal to start with." "You won't wear that old waistcoat, will you, Dick?" "Bless you, no. Why, I didn't mean to be personal, dear Dick," she said, fearing she'd hurt his feelings. "'Tis a very nice waistcoat, but what I meant was that though it is an excellent waistcoat for a settled down man, it is not quite one for—" She waited, and a blush expanded over her face, and then she went on again. "For going courting in." "No, I'll wear my best winter one, with the leather lining that mother made. It's a beautiful handsome waistcoat inside, yes, as ever anybody saw. In fact, only the other day I unbuttoned it to show a chap that very lining, and he said it was the strongest, handsomest lining you could wish to see on the king's waistcoat himself. 'I don't quite know what to wear,' she said, as if her habitual indifference alone to dress had kept back so important a subject till now. 'Why, that blue frock you wore last week.' 'Doesn't set well around the neck. I couldn't wear that.' 'But I shan't care.' 'No, you won't mind.' 'Well, then it's all right, because you only care how you look to me, do you, dear? I only dress for you, that's certain.' 'Yes, but you see I couldn't appear in it again very well.' 'Any strange gentleman you might meet in your journey might notice the set of it, I suppose. Fancy, men in love don't think so much about how they look to other women.' It is difficult to say whether a tone of playful banter or of gentle reproach prevailed in the speech. "Well then, Dick," she said with good-humoured frankness, "I'll own it. I shouldn't like a stranger to see me dress badly, even though I am in love. 'Tis our nature, I suppose." "You perfect woman!" "Yes, if you lay the stress on woman," she murmured, looking at a group of hollyhocks in flower, round which a crowd of butterflies had gathered like female idlers round a bonnet shop. "But about the dress, why not wear the one you wore at our party?" "That sets well, but a girl of the name of Bet Taller, who lives near our house, has had one made like it, only in pattern, though of miserably cheap stuff, and I couldn't wear it on that account. Dear me, I'm afraid I can't go now." "Oh yes, you must, I know you will," said Dick with dismay. "Why not wear the one you've got on?" "What, this old one?" "After all, I think that by wearing my grey one Saturday, I can make the blue one do for Sunday. Yes, I will. A hat or bonnet, which shall it be? Which do I look best in?" "Well, I think the bonnet is nicest, more quiet and matronly." "What's the objection to a hat? Does it make me look old?" "Oh no, the hat is well enough, but it makes you look rather too— you won't mind me saying it, dear?" "Not at all, for I shall wear the bonnet." "Rather too coquettish and flirty for an engaged young woman." She reflected a minute. Yes, yes. Still, after all, the hat would do best. Hats are best, you see. Yes, I must wear the hat, dear Dicky, because I ought to wear a hat, you know. End of section 20. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Under the Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Beginning of part the 4th. Autumn. Chapter 1. Going Nutting. Dick, dressed in his second best suit, burst into Fancy's sitting room with a glow of pleasure on his face. It was 2 o'clock on Friday, the day before her contemplated visit to her father, and for some reason connected with cleaning the school, the children had been given this Friday afternoon for pastime, in addition to the usual Saturday. Fancy, it happens just right that it's a leisure half-day with you. Smart is lame in his near foot afore, and so as I can't do anything, I've made a holiday afternoon of it, and am come for you to go nutting with me." She was sitting by the parlour window with a blue frock lying across her lap and scissors in her hand. "Go nutting? Yes, but I'm afraid I can't go for an hour or so." "Why not? 'Tis the only spare afternoon we may both have together for weeks." "This dress of mine, which I'm going to wear on Sunday at Yalbury. I find it fits so badly that I must alter it a little after all. I told the dressmaker to make it by a pattern I gave her at the time. Instead of that, she did it her own way, and made me look a perfect fright." "How long will you be?" he inquired, looking rather disappointed. "Not long. Do wait and talk to me. Come, do, dear." Dick sat down. The talking progressed very favourably amid the snipping and sewing till about 2:30, at which time his conversation began to be varied by a slight tapping upon his toe with a walking stick he had cut from the hedge as he came along. Fancy talked and answered him, but sometimes the answers were so negligently given that it was evident her thoughts lay for the greater part in her lap with the blue dress. The clock struck 3. Dick arose from his seat, walked round the room with his hands behind him, examining all the furniture, then sounded a few notes on the harmonium, then looked inside all the books he could find, then smoothed Fancy's head with his hand. Still the snipping and sewing went on. The clock struck 4. Dick fidgeted about, yawned privately, counted the knots in the table, yawned publicly, counted the flies on the ceiling, yawned horribly, went into the kitchen and scullery, and so thoroughly studied the principle on which the pump was constructed that he could have delivered a lecture on the subject. Stepping back to Fancy, and finding still that she had not done, he went into her garden and looked at her cabbages and potatoes, and reminded himself that they seemed to him to wear a decidedly feminine aspect, then pulled up several weeds and came in again. The clock struck 5, and still the snipping and sewing went on. Dick attempted to kill a fly, peeled all the rind off his walking stick, then threw the stick into the scullery because it was spoilt, produced hideous discords from the harmonium, and accidentally overturned a vase of flowers, the water from which ran in a rill across the table and dribbled to the floor, where it formed a lake, the shape of which, after the lapse of a few minutes, he began to modify considerably with his foot, till it was like a map of England and Wales. "Well, Dick, you needn't have made quite such a mess." "Well, I needn't, I suppose." He walked up to the blue dress and looked at it with a rigid gaze. Then an idea seemed to cross his brain. "Fancy." "Yes." "I thought you said you were going to wear your grey gown all day to-morrow on your trip to Yalbury, and in the evening too, when I shall be with you and ask your father for you." "So I am." "And the blue one only on Sunday?" "And the blue one Sunday." "Well, dear, I shan't be at Yalbury Sunday to see it." "No, but I shall walk to Longpuddle Church in the afternoon with father, and such lots of people will be looking at me there, you know, and it did set so badly round the neck." "I never noticed it, and 'tis like nobody else would." "They might." "Then why not wear the grey one on Sunday as well? 'Tis as pretty as the blue one." "I might make the grey one do, certainly, but it isn't so good. It didn't cost half so much as this one, and besides it would be the same I wore Saturday." "Then wear the striped one, dear." "I might." "Or the dark one." "Yes, I might, but I want to wear a fresh one they haven't seen." I see," said Dick, in a voice in which the tones of love were decidedly inconvenienced by a considerable emphasis, his thoughts meanwhile running as follows: "I, the man she loves best in the world, as she says, am to understand that my poor half-holiday is to be lost because she wants to wear on Sunday a gown there is not the slightest necessity for wearing, simply, in fact, to appear more striking than usual in the eyes of Longpuddle young men. and I not there either." "Then there are 3 dresses good enough for my eyes, but neither is good enough for the youths of Longpuddle," he said. "No, not that exactly, Dick. Still, you see, I do want to look pretty to them. There, that's honest. But I shan't be much longer." "How much?" "A quarter of an hour." "Very well, I'll come in a quarter of an hour." "Why go away?" "I mid as well." He went out, walked down the road, and sat upon a gate. Here he meditated, and the more he meditated, the more decidedly did he begin to fume. And the more positive was he that his time had been scandalously trifled with by Miss Fancy Day, that, so far from being the simple girl who had never had a sweetheart before, as she had solemnly assured him time after time, she was, if not a flirt, a woman who had had no end of admirers, a girl most certainly too anxious about her frocks, a girl whose feelings, though warm, were not deep, a girl who cared a great deal too much how she appeared in the eyes of other men. What she loves best in the world, he thought, with an incipient spice of his father's grimness, is her hair and complexion. What she loves next best, her gowns and hats. What she loves next best, myself, perhaps. Suffering great anguish at this disloyalty in himself and harshness to his darling, yet disposed to persevere in it, a horribly cruel thought crossed his mind. He would not call for her, as he had promised, at the end of quarter of an hour. Yes, it would be a punishment she well deserved. Although the best part of the afternoon had been wasted, he would go nutting as he had intended, and go by himself. He leaped over the gate and pushed up the lane for nearly 2 miles, till a winding path called Snail Creep sloped up a hill and entered a hazel copse by a hole like a rabbit's burrow. In he plunged, vanished among the bushes, and in a short time there was no sign of his existence upon earth, save an occasional rustling of boughs and snapping of twigs in divers points of Grey's Wood. Never man nutted as Dick nutted that afternoon. He worked like a galley slave. Half hour after half hour passed away, and still he gathered without ceasing. At last, when the sun had set and bunches of nuts could not be distinguished from the leaves which nourished them, he shouldered his bag, containing quite 2 pecks of the finest produce of the wood, about as much use to him as 2 pecks of stones from the road, strolled down the woodland track, crossed the highway, and entered the homeward lane, whistling as he went. Probably Miss Fancy Day never before or after stood so low in Mr. Dewy's opinion as on that afternoon. In fact, it is just possible that a few more blue dresses on the Longpuddle young men's account would have clarified Dick's brain entirely, and made him once more a free man. But Venus had planned other developments, at any rate for the present. Cuckoo Lane, the way he pursued, passed over a ridge which rose keenly against the sky about 50 yards in his van. Here, upon the bright afterglow about the horizon, was now visible an irregular shape, which at first he conceived to be a bough standing a little beyond the line of its neighbours. Then it seemed to move, and as he advanced still further, there was no doubt that it was a living being sitting in the bank, head bowed on hand. The grassy margin entirely prevented his footsteps from being heard, and it was not till he was close that the figure recognized him. Up it sprang, and he was face to face with Fancy. "Dick! Dick! Oh, is it you, Dick?" "Yes, Fancy," said Dick, in a rather repentant tone, and lowering his nuts. She ran up to him, flung her parasol on the grass, put her little head against his breast, and then there began a narrative, disjointed by such hysterical weeping as was never surpassed for intensity in the whole history of love. "Oh, Dick, she sobbed out. "Where have you been away from me? Oh, I have suffered agony and thought you would never come any more. 'Tis cruel, Dick. No, 'tisn't. It is justice. I've been walking miles and miles up and down Grey's Wood trying to find you till I was wearied and worn out, and I could walk no further and had come back this far. Oh, Dick, directly you were gone I thought I had offended you, and I put down the dress. 'Tisn't finished now, and I never will finish it, and I'll wear an old one Sunday. Yes, Dick, I will, and because I don't care what I wear when you are not by my side. You think I do, but I don't. And I ran after you, and I saw you go up Snail Creep and not look back once, and then you plunged in, and I after you. But I was too far behind. Oh, I did wish the horrid branches had been cut down, so that I could see your dear shape again. And then I called out to you, and nobody answered, and I was afraid to call very loud, lest anybody else should hear me. Then I kept wandering and wandering about, and it was dreadful misery, Dick. And then I shut my eyes and fell to picturing you looking at some other woman, very pretty and nice, but with no affection or truth in her at all, and then imagined you saying to yourself, 'Ah, she's as good as Fancy, for Fancy told me a story and was a flirt and cared for herself more than me, so now I'll have this one for my sweetheart.' Oh, you won't, will you, Dick? For I do love you so." It is scarcely necessary to add that Dick renounced his freedom there and then, and kissed her 10 times over, and promised that no pretty woman of the kind alluded to should ever engross his thoughts. In short, that though he had been vexed with her, all such vexation was past, and that henceforth and for ever it was simply Fancy or death for him. And then they set about proceeding homewards, very slowly on account of Fancy's weariness, she leaning upon his shoulder, and in addition receiving support from his arm round her waist, though she had sufficiently recovered from her desperate condition to sing to him, "Why are you wandering here, I pray?" during the latter part of their walk. Nor is it necessary to describe in detail how the bag of nuts was quite forgotten until 3 days later, when it was found among the brambles and restored empty to Mrs. Dewy, her initials being marked therein in red cotton, and how she puzzled herself till her head ached upon the question of how on earth her meal bag could have got into Cuckoo Lane. End of section 21. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy, Part 4, Chapter 2, Honey-taking, and Afterwards. Saturday evening saw Dick Dewy journeying on foot to Yalbury Wood, according to the arrangement with Fancy. The landscape being concave, at the going down of the sun everything suddenly assumed a uniform robe of shade. The evening advanced from sunset to dusk long before Dick's arrival, and his progress during the latter portion of his walk through the trees was indicated by the flutter of terrified birds that had been roosting over the path. And in crossing the glades, masses of hot dry air that had been formed on the hills during the day greeted his cheeks alternately with clouds of damp night air from the valleys. He reached the keeper steward's house, where the grass plot and the garden in front appeared light and pale against the unbroken darkness of the grove from which he had emerged, and paused at the garden gate. He had scarcely been there a minute when he beheld a sort of procession advancing from the door in his front. It consisted first of Enoch the trapper, carrying a spade on his shoulder and a lantern dangling in his hand. Then came Mrs. Day, the light of the lantern revealing that she bore in her arms curious objects about a foot long, in the form of Latin crosses, made of lath and brown paper dipped in brimstone, called matches by bee-masters. Next came Miss Day, with a shawl thrown over her head, and behind all, in the gloom, Mr. Frederick Shiner. Dick, in his consternation at finding Shiner present, was at a loss how to proceed, and retired under a tree to collect his thoughts. "Here I be, Enoch," said a voice, and the procession advancing farther, the lantern rays illuminated the figure of Geoffrey awaiting their arrival beside a row of beehives in front of the path. Taking the spade from Enoch, he proceeded to dig 2 holes in the earth beside the hives, the others standing round in a circle except Mrs. Day, who deposited her matches in the fork of an apple tree and returned to the house. The party remaining were now lit up in front by the lantern in their midst, their shadows radiating each way upon the garden plot like the spokes of a wheel. An apparent embarrassment of Fancy at the presence of Shiner caused a silence in the assembly, during which the preliminaries of execution were arranged, the matches fixed, the stake kindled, the 2 hives placed over the 2 holes, and the earth stopped round the edges. Geoffrey then stood erect and rather more, to straighten his backbone after the digging. "They were a peculiar family," said Mr. Shiner, regarding the hives reflectively. Geoffrey nodded. "Those holes will be the grave of thousands," said Fancy. "I think 'tis rather a cruel thing to do." Her father shook his head. "No," he said, tapping the hives to shake the dead bees from their cells. "If you suffocate 'em this way, they only die once. If you fumigate 'em in the new way, they come to life again and die of starvation. So the pangs of death be twice upon 'em." "I incline to Fancy's notion," said Mr. Shiner, laughing lightly. "The proper way to take honey so that the bees be neither starved nor murdered is a puzzling matter," said the keeper steadily. "I should like never to take it from them," said Fancy. "But 'tis the money," said Enoch musingly, "for without money man is a shadder." The lantern light had disturbed many bees that had escaped from hives destroyed some days earlier, and demoralized by affliction were now getting a living as marauders about the doors of other hives. Several flew round the head and neck of Geoffrey, then darted upon him with an irritating bizz. Enoch threw down the lantern and ran off, and pushed his head into a currant bush. Fancy scudded up the path, and Mr. Shiner floundered away helter-skelter among the cabbages. Geoffrey stood his ground, unmoved and firm as a rock. Fancy was the first to return, followed by Enoch, picking up the lantern. Mr. Shiner still remained invisible. "Have the craters stung ye?" said Enoch to Geoffrey. "No, not much, only a little here and there," he said with leisurely solemnity, shaking one bee out of his shirt sleeve, pulling another from among his hair, and 2 or 3 more from his neck. The rest looked on during this proceeding with a complacent sense of being out of it, much as a European nation in a state of internal commotion is watched by its neighbours. "Are those all of them, father?" said Fancy, when Geoffrey had pulled away 5. "Almost all, though I feel 1 or 2 more sticking into my shoulder and side. Ah, there's another just begun again upon my backbone. You lively young mortals, how did you get inside there? However, they can't sting me many times more, poor things, for they must be getting weak. They mid as well stay in me till bedtime now, I suppose." As he himself was the only person affected by this arrangement, it seemed satisfactory enough, and after a noise of feet kicking against cabbages in a blundering progress among them, the voice of Mr. Shiner was heard from the darkness in that direction. "Is all quite safe again?" No answer being returned to this query, he apparently assumed that he might venture forth, and gradually drew near the lantern again. The hives were now removed from their position over the holes, one being handed to Enoch to carry indoors, and one being taken by Geoffrey himself. "Bring hither the lantern, Fancy. The spade can bide." Geoffrey and Enoch then went towards the house, leaving Shiner and Fancy standing side by side on the garden plot. "Allow me," said Shiner, stooping for the lantern and seizing it at the same time with Fancy. "I can carry it," said Fancy, religiously repressing all inclination to trifle. She had thoroughly considered that subject after the tearful explanation of the bird-catching adventure to Dick, and had decided that it would be dishonest in her, as an engaged young woman, to trifle with men's eyes and hands any more. Finding that Shiner still retained his hold of the lantern, she relinquished it, and he, having found her retaining it, also let go. The lantern fell and was extinguished. Fancy moved on. "Where is the path?" said Mr. Shiner. "Here," said Fancy. "Your eyes will get used to the dark in a minute or two." "Till that time will ye lend me your hand?" Fancy gave him the extreme tips of her fingers, and they stepped from the plot into the path. "You don't accept attentions very freely." "It depends upon who offers them." "A fellow like me, for instance." A dead silence. "Well, what do you say, missy?" "It then depends upon how they are offered." "Not wildly, and yet not careless like; not purposely, and yet not by chance; not too quick, nor yet too slow." "How then?" said Fancy. "Coolly and practically," he said. "How would that kind of love be taken? Not anxiously, and yet not indifferently; neither blushing nor pale, nor religiously, nor yet quite wickedly." "Well, how?" "Not at all." Geoffrey Day's storehouse at the back of his dwelling was hung with bunches of dried horehound, mint and sage, brown paper bags of thyme and lavender, and long ropes of clean onions. On shelves were spread large red and yellow apples, and choice selections of early potatoes for seed next year, vulgar crowds of commoner kind lying beneath in heaps. A few empty beehives were clustered around a nail in one corner, under which stood 2 or 3 barrels of new cider of the first crop, each bubbling and squirting forth from the yet open bunghole. Fancy was now kneeling beside the 2 inverted hives, one of which rested against her lap for convenience in operating upon the contents. She thrust her sleeves above her elbows, and inserted her small pink hand edgewise between each white lobe of honeycomb, performing the act so adroitly and gently as not to unseal a single cell. Then, cracking the piece off at the crown of the hive by a slight backward and forward movement, she lifted each portion, as it was loosened, into a large blue platter placed on a bench at her side. "Bother these little mortals," said Geoffrey, who was holding the light to her and giving his back an uneasy twist. "I really think I may as well go indoors and take 'em out, poor things, for they won't let me alone. There's 2 a-stinging with all their might now. I'm sure I wonder their strength can last so long." "All right, friend, I'll hold the candle while you're gone," said Mr. Shiner, leisurely taking the light and allowing Geoffrey to depart, which he did with his usual long paces. He could hardly have gone round to the house door when other footsteps were heard approaching the outbuilding. The tip of a finger appeared in the hole through which the wood latch was lifted, and Dick Dewy came in, having been all this time walking up and down the wood, vainly waiting for Shiner's departure. Fancy looked up and welcomed him rather confusedly. Shiner grasped the candlestick more firmly, and lest doing this in silence should not imply to Dick with sufficient force that he was quite at home and cool, he sang invincibly, "King Arthur, he had 3 sons." "Father here?" said Dick. "Indoors, I think," said Fancy, looking pleasantly at him. Dick surveyed the scene, and did not seem inclined to hurry off just at that moment. Shiner went on singing: "The miller was drowned in his pond, the weaver was hung in his yarn, and the devil ran away with the little tailor, and the broadcloth under his arm." "That's a terrible crippled rhyme, if that's your rhyme," said Dick, with a grain of superciliousness in his tone. "It's no use your complaining to me about the rhyme," said Mr. Shiner. "You must go to the man that made it." Fancy by this time had acquired confidence. "Taste a bit, Mr. Dewy," she said, holding up to him a small circular piece of honeycomb that had been the last in the row of layers, remaining still on her knees and flinging back her head to look in his face, "and then I'll taste a bit too." "And I, if you please," said Mr. Shiner. Nevertheless, the farmer looked superior, as if he could even now hardly join the trifling from very importance of station, and after receiving the honeycomb from Fancy, he turned it over in his hands till the cells began to be crushed and the liquid honey ran down from his fingers in a thin string. Suddenly a faint cry from Fancy caused them to gaze at her. "What's the matter, dear?" said Dick. "It is nothing, but a bee has stung the inside of my lip. He was in one of the cells I was eating." "We must keep down the swelling, or it may be serious," said Shiner, stepping up and kneeling beside her. "Let me see it." "No, no." "Just let me see it," said Dick, kneeling on the other side, and after some hesitation she pressed down her lip with one finger to show the place. "Oh, I hope 'twill soon be better. I don't mind a sting in ordinary places, but it's so bad upon your lip," she added, with tears in her eyes and writhing a little from the pain. Shiner held the light above his head and pushed his face close to Fancy's, as if the lip had been shown exclusively to himself, upon which Dick pushed closer, as if Shiner were not there at all. "It is swelling," said Dick to her right aspect. "It isn't swelling," said Shiner to her left aspect. "Is it dangerous on the lip?" cried Fancy. "I know it is dangerous on the tongue." "Oh no, not dangerous," answered Dick. "Rather dangerous," had answered Shiner simultaneously. "I must try to bear it," said Fancy, turning again to the hives. "Hartshorn and oil is a good thing to put on it, Miss Day," said Shiner with great concern. "Sweet oil and hartshorn I've found to be a good thing to cure stings, Miss Day," said Dick with greater concern. "We have some mixed indoors. Would you kindly run and get it for me?" she said. Now, whether by inadvertence or whether by mischievous intention, the individuality of the "you" was so carelessly denoted that both Dick and Shiner sprang to their feet like twin acrobats and marched abreast to the door. Both seized the latch and lifted it, and continued marching on shoulder to shoulder in the same manner to the dwelling house. Not only so, but entering the room they marched as before, straight up to Mrs. Day's chair, letting the door in the oak partition slam so forcibly that the rose of pewter on the dresser rang like a bell. "Mrs. Day, Fancy has stung her lip and wants you to give me the hartshorn, please," said Mr. Shiner, very close to Mrs. Day's face. "Oh, Mrs. Day, Fancy has asked me to bring out the hartshorn, please, because she has stung her lip," said Dick, a little closer to Mrs. Day's face. "Well, men alive, that's no reason why you should eat me, I suppose," said Mrs. Day, drawing back. She searched in the corner cupboard, producing the bottle, and began to dust the cork, the rim, and every other part very carefully, Dick's hand and Shiner's hand waiting side by side. "Which is head man?" said Mrs. Day. "Now, don't come mum-budgeting so close again. Which is head man?" Neither spoke, and the bottle was inclined towards Shiner. Shiner, as a high-class man, would not look in the least triumphant, and turned to go off with it as Geoffrey came downstairs after the search in his linen for concealed bees. "Oh, that you, Master Dewy?" Dick assured the keeper that it was, and the young man then determined upon a bold stroke for the attainment of his end, forgetting that the worst of bold strokes is the disastrous consequences they involve if they fail. "I've come on purpose to speak to you very particular, Mr. Day," he said, with a crushing emphasis intended for the ears of Mr. Shiner, who was vanishing round the doorpost at that moment. "Well, I've been forced to go upstairs and unrind myself and shake some bees out of me," said Geoffrey, walking slowly towards the open door and standing on the threshold. "The young rascal's got into my shirt and wouldn't be quiet nohow." Dick followed him to the door. "I've come to speak a word to you," he repeated, looking out at the pale mist creeping up from the gloom of the valley. "You may perhaps guess what it is about." The keeper lowered his hands into the depths of his pocket, twirled his eyes, balanced himself on his toes, looked as perpendicularly downward as if his glance were a plumb line, then horizontally, collecting together the cracks that lay about his face till they were all in the neighbourhood of his eyes. "Maybe I don't know," he replied. Dick said nothing, and the stillness was disturbed only by some small bird that was being killed by an owl in the adjoining wood, whose cry passed into the silence without mingling with it. "I've left my hat up in chamber," said Geoffrey. "Wait while I step up and get en." "I'll be in the garden," said Dick. He went round by a side wicket into the garden, and Geoffrey went upstairs. It was the custom in Mellstock and its vicinity to discuss matters of pleasure and ordinary business inside the house, and to reserve the garden for very important affairs, a custom which, as is supposed, originated in the desirability of getting away at such times from the other members of the family, when there was only one room for living in, though it was now quite as frequently practised by those who suffered from no such limitation to the size of their domiciles. The head keeper's form appeared in the dusky garden, and Dick walked towards him. The elder paused and leant over the rail of a piggery that stood on the left of the path, upon which Dick did the same, and they both contemplated a whitish shadowy shape that was moving about and grunting among the straw of the interior. "I've come to ask for Fancy," said Dick. "I'd as lief you hadn't." "Why should that be, Mr. Day?" "Because it makes me say that you've come to ask what you be'n't likely to have. Have ye come for anything else?" "Nothing." "Then I'll just tell 'ee as you've come on a very foolish errand. D'ye know what her mother was?" "No." "A teacher in a landed family's nursery, who was foolish enough to marry the keeper of the same establishment, for I was only a keeper then, though now I've a dozen other irons in the fire as steward here for my lord, what with the timber sales and the yearly fellings, and the gravel and sand sales, and one thing and t'other. However, d'ye think Fancy picked up her good manners, the smooth turn of her tongue, her musical notes, and her knowledge of books in a homely hole like this?" "No." "D'ye know where?" "No." "Well, when I went a wandering after her mother's death, she lived with her aunt, who kept a boarding school, till her aunt married Lawyer Green, a man as sharp as a needle, and the school was broke up. Did ye know that then she went to the training school, and that her name stood first among the Queen's scholars of her year?" "I've heard so." "And that when she sat for her certificate as government teacher, she had the highest of the first class?" "Yes." "Well, and do ye know what I live in such a miserly way for, when I've got enough to do without it? And why I make her work as a schoolmistress instead of living here?" "No." "That if a gentleman who sees her to be his equal in polish should want to marry her, and she want to marry him, he shan't be superior to her in pocket. Now, do ye think after this that you be good enough for her?" "No." "Then good night to ye, Master Dewy." "Good night, Mr. Day." Modest Dick's reply had faltered upon his tongue, and he turned away, wondering at his presumption in asking for a woman who he had seen from the beginning to be so superior to him. End of section 22. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Under the Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Part 4, Chapter 3. Fancy in the Rain. The next scene is a tempestuous afternoon in the following month, and Fancy Day is discovered walking from her father's home towards Mellstock. A single vast grey cloud covered the country, from which the small rain and mist had just begun to blow down in wavy sheets, alternating thick and thin. The trees of the fields and plantations writhed like miserable men as the air wound its way swiftly among them. The lowest portions of their trunks, that had hardly ever been known to move, were visibly rocked by the fiercer gusts, distressing the mind by its painful unwontedness, as when a strong man is seen to shed tears. Low hanging boughs went up and down, high and erect boughs went to and fro, the blasts being so irregular and divided into so many cross currents that neighbouring branches of the same tree swept the skies in independent motions, crossed each other, or became entangled. Across the open spaces flew flocks of green and yellowish leaves, which, after travelling a long distance from their parent trees, reached the ground and lay there with their undersides upward. As the rain and wind increased, and Fancy's bonnet ribbons leapt more and more snappishly against her chin, she paused on entering Mellstock Lane to consider her latitude and the distance to a place of shelter. The nearest house was Elizabeth Endorfield's, in Higher Mellstock, whose cottage and garden stood not far from the junction of that hamlet with the road she followed. Fancy hastened onward, and in 5 minutes entered a gate which shed upon her toes a flood of water drops as she opened it. "Come in, child," a voice exclaimed, before Fancy had knocked, a promptness that would have surprised her had she not known that Mrs. Endorfield was an exceedingly and exceptionally sharp woman in the use of her eyes and ears. Fancy went in and sat down. Elizabeth was paring potatoes for her husband's supper. Scrape, 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 then a toss, and splash went a potato into a bucket of water. Now, as Fancy listlessly noted these proceedings of the dame, she began to reconsider an old subject that lay uppermost in her heart. Since the interview between her father and Dick, the days had been melancholy days for her. Geoffrey's firm opposition to the notion of Dick as a son-in-law was more than she had expected. She had frequently seen her lover since that time, it is true, and had loved him more for the opposition than she would have otherwise dreamt of doing, which was a happiness of a certain kind. Yet, though love is thus an end in itself, it must be believed to be the means to another end if it is to assume the rosy hues of an unalloyed pleasure, and such a belief Fancy and Dick were emphatically denied just now. Elizabeth Endorfield had a repute among women which was in its nature something between distinction and notoriety. It was founded on the following items of character. She was shrewd and penetrating. Her house stood in a lonely place. She never went to church. She wore a red cloak. She always retained her bonnet indoors, and she had a pointed chin. Thus far her attributes were distinctly satanic, and those who looked no further called her in plain terms a witch. But she was not gaunt nor ugly in the upper part of her face, nor particularly strange in manner, so that when her more intimate acquaintances spoke of her, the term was softened, and she became simply a deep body, who was as long-headed as she was high. It may be stated that Elizabeth belonged to a class of suspects who were gradually losing their mysterious characteristics under the administration of the young vicar, though during the long reign of Mr. Grinham the parish of Mellstock had proved extremely favourable to the growth of witches. While Fancy was revolving all this in her mind, and putting it to herself whether it was worth while to tell her troubles to Elizabeth and ask her advice in getting out of them, the witch spoke. "You be down, proper down," she said suddenly, dropping another potato into the bucket. Fancy took no notice. "About your young man?" Fancy reddened. Elizabeth seemed to be watching her thoughts. Really, one would almost think she must have the powers people ascribe to her. "Father not in the humour for it, hey?" Another potato was finished and flung in. "Ah, I know about it. Little birds tell me things that people don't dream of my knowing." Fancy was desperate about Dick, and here was a chance, oh, such a wicked chance, of getting help. And what was goodness beside love? I wish you'd tell me how to put him in the humour for it," she said. "That I could soon do," said the witch quietly. "Really? Oh, do! Anyhow, I don't care, so that it is done. How could I do it, Mrs. Endorfield?" "Nothing so mighty wonderful in it." "Well, but how?" "By witchery, of course," said Elizabeth. "No," said Fancy. "'Tis, I assure ye. Didn't you ever hear I was a witch?" "Well," hesitated Fancy, "I have heard you called so." "And you believed it?" "I can't say that I did exactly believe it, for 'tis very horrible and wicked. But, oh, how I do wish it was possible for you to be one!" "So I am. And I'll tell you how to bewitch your father to let you marry Dick Dewy." "Will it hurt him, poor thing?" "Hurt who?" "Father." "No. The charm is worked by common sense, and the spell can only be broke by your acting stupidly." Fancy looked rather perplexed, and Elizabeth went on. "This fear of Liz, whatever 'tis, by great and small, she makes pretence to common sense, and that's all. You must do it like this." The witch laid down her knife and potato, and then poured into Fancy's ear a long and detailed list of directions, glancing up from the corner of her eye into Fancy's face with an expression of sinister humour. Fancy's face brightened, clouded, rose and sank as the narrative proceeded. "There," said Elizabeth at last, stooping for the knife and another potato. "Do that, and you'll have him by long and by late, my dear." "And do it I will," said Fancy. She then turned her attention to the external world once more. The rain continued as usual, but the wind had abated considerably during the discourse. Judging that it was now possible to keep an umbrella erect, she pulled her hood again over her bonnet, bade the witch good-bye, and went her way. End of section 23. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Part 4, Chapter 4. The Spell. Mrs. Endorfield's advice was duly followed. "I be proper sorry that your daughter isn't so well as she might be," said a Mellstock man to Geoffrey one morning. "But is there anything in it?" said Geoffrey uneasily, as he shifted his hat to the right. "I can't understand the report. She didn't complain to me a bit when I saw her." "No appetite at all, they say." Geoffrey crossed to Mellstock and called at the school that afternoon. Fancy welcomed him as usual, and asked him to stay and take tea with her. "I ben't much for tea this time of day," he said, but stayed. During the meal he watched her narrowly, and to his great consternation discovered the following unprecedented change in the healthy girl: that she cut herself only a diaphanous slice of bread and butter, and laying it on her plate passed the meal time in breaking it into pieces, but eating no more than about 1/10 of the slice. Geoffrey hoped she would say something about Dick, and finish up by weeping, as she'd done after the decision against him a few days subsequent to the interview in the garden, but nothing was said, and in due time Geoffrey departed again for Yalbury Wood. "'Tis to be hoped poor Miss Fancy will be able to keep on her school," said Geoffrey's man Enoch to Geoffrey the following week, as they were shovelling up anthills in the wood. Geoffrey stuck in the shovel, swept 7 or 8 ants from his sleeve, and killed another that was prowling round his ear, then looked perpendicularly into the earth as usual, waiting for Enoch to say more. "Well, why shouldn't she?" said the keeper at last. "The baker told me yesterday," continued Enoch, shaking out another emmet that had run merrily up his thigh, that the bread he've left at that there schoolhouse this last month would starve any mouse in the three creations, that 'twould so. And afterwards I had a pint of small down at the moors, and there I heard more." "What might that have been?" "That she used to have a pound of the best rolled butter a week, reg'lar as clockwork, from Dairyman Viney's for herself, as well as just so much salted for the helping girl and the 'ooman she calls in. But now the same quantity to last her 3 weeks, and then 'tis thoughted she throws it away sour." "Finish doing the emmets and carry the bag home along." The keeper resumed his gun, tucked it under his arm, and went on without whistling to the dogs, who however followed, with a bearing meant to imply that they did not expect any such attentions when their master was reflecting. On Saturday morning a note came from Fancy. He was not to trouble about sending her the couple of rabbits, as was intended, because she feared she would not want them. Later in the day Geoffrey went to Casterbridge and called upon the butcher who served Fancy with fresh meat, which was put down to her father's account. "I've called to pay up our little bill, neighbour Haylock, and you can give me the child's account at the same time." Mr. Haylock turned round 3/4 of a circle in the midst of a heap of joints, altered the expression of his face from meat to money, went into a little office consisting only of a door and a window, looked very vigorously into a book which possessed length but no breadth, and then seizing a piece of paper and scribbling thereupon, handed the bill. Probably it was the first time in the history of commercial transactions that the quality of shortness in a butcher's bill was a cause of tribulation to the debtor. "Why, this isn't all she've had in a whole month," said Geoffrey. "Every morsel," said the butcher. "Now, Dan, take that leg and shoulder to Mrs. White's, and this £11 here to Mr. Martin's. You've been treating her to smaller joints lately, to my thinking, Mr. Day." "Only 2 or 3 little scram rabbits this last week, as I am alive. I wish I had." "Well, my wife said to me—" "Dan, not too much on that tray at a time, better go twice." "My wife said to me as she posted up the books, she says, 'Miss Day must have been affronted this summer during that hot muggy weather that spoilt so much for us, for depend upon't,' she says, 'she's been trying John Grimmett unknown to us. See her account else. 'Tis little of course at the best of times, being only for one, but now 'tis next kin to nothing." "I'll inquire," said Geoffrey despondingly. He returned by way of Mellstock and called upon Fancy in fulfilment of a promise. It being Saturday, the children were enjoying a holiday, and on entering the residence Fancy was nowhere to be seen. Nan, the charwoman, was sweeping the kitchen. "Where's my daughter?" said the keeper. "Well, you see, she was tired with the week's teaching, and this morning she said, 'Nan, I shan't get up till the evening.' You see, Mr. Day, if people don't eat they can't work, and as she's gived up eating, she must give up working." "Have ye carried up any dinner to her?" "No, she don't want any. There, we all know that such things don't come without good reason. Not that I wish to say anything about a broken heart or anything of that kind." Geoffrey's own heart felt inconveniently large just then. He went to the staircase and ascended to his daughter's door. "Fancy!" "Come in, father." To see a person in bed from any cause whatever on a fine afternoon is depressing enough, and here was his only child, Fancy, not only in bed but looking very pale. Geoffrey was visibly disturbed. "Fancy, I didn't expect to see thee here, child," he said. "What's the matter?" "I'm not well, father." "How's that?" "Because I think of things." "What things can you have to think of so mortal much?" "You know, father." You think I've been cruel to thee in saying that penniless Dick o' thine shan't marry thee, I suppose?" No answer. "Well, you know, Fancy, I do it for the best, and he isn't good enough for thee. You know that well enough." Here he again looked at her as she lay. "Well, Fancy, I can't let my only child die, and if you can't live without en, you must have en, I suppose." "Oh, I don't want him like that, all against your will, and everything so disobedient," sighed the invalid. No, 'tisn't against my will. My wish is, now I do see how 'tis hurting thee to live without en, that he shall marry thee as soon as we've considered a little. That's my wish, flat and plain, Fancy. There, never cry, my little maid. You ought to have cried before. No need of crying now 'tis all over. Well, howsoever, try to step over and see me and mother-in-law to morrow, and hae a bit of dinner wi' us." "And Dick too?" "Ay, Dick too, far as I know." "And when do you think you'll have considered, father, and he may marry me?" she coaxed. "Well, there, say next midsummer. That's not a day too long to wait." On leaving the school, Geoffrey went to the tranter's. Old William opened the door. "Is your grandson Dick in within, William?" "No, not just now, Mr. Day, though he've been at home a good deal lately." "Oh, how's that?" "What with one thing and what with t'other, he's all in a mope, as might be said. Don't seem the feller he used to. Ay, I will sit studding and thinking as if 'a were going to turn chapel member, and then do nothing but traipse and wamble about. Used to be such a chatty boy too, Dick did, and now 'a don't speak at all. But won't you step inside? Reuben'll be home soon, I believe." "No, thank you, I can't stay now. Will ye just ask Dick if he'll do me the kindness to step over to Yalbury to morrow with my daughter Fancy, if she's well enough? I don't like her to come by herself, now she's not so terrible topping in health." "So I've heard. Ay, sure, I'll tell him without fail." End of section 24. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Of Under the Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy. Part 4, Chapter 5. After gaining her point. The visit to Geoffrey passed off as delightfully as a visit might have been expected to pass off when it was the first day of smooth experience in a hitherto obstructed love course. And then came a series of several happy days of the same undisturbed serenity. Dick could court her when he chose, stay away when he chose, which was never, walk with her by winding streams and waterfalls and autumn scenery till dews and twilight sent them home. And thus they drew near the day of the harvest thanksgiving, which was also the time chosen for opening the organ in Mellstock church. It chanced that Dick on that very day was called away from Mellstock. A young acquaintance had died of consumption at Charmley, a neighbouring village, on the previous Monday, and Dick, in fulfilment of a long-standing promise, was to assist in carrying him to the grave. When on Tuesday Dick went towards the school to acquaint Fancy with the fact, it is difficult to say whether his own disappointment at being denied the sight of her triumphant debut as organist was greater than his vexation that his pet should on this great occasion be deprived of the pleasure of his presence. However, the intelligence was communicated. She bore it as best she could, not without many expressions of regret, and convictions that her performance would be nothing to her now. Just before 11 o'clock on Sunday he set out upon his sad errand. The funeral was to be immediately after the morning service, and as there were 4 good miles to walk, driving being inconvenient, it became necessary to start comparatively early. Half an hour later would certainly have answered his purpose quite as well, yet at the last moment nothing would content his ardent mind but that he must go a mile out of his way in the direction of the school, in the hope of getting a glimpse of his love as she started for church. Striking therefore into the lane towards the school instead of across the Ewelease direct to Charmley, he arrived opposite her door as his goddess emerged. If ever a woman looked a divinity, Fancy Day appeared one that morning as she floated down those school steps, in the form of a nebulous collection of colours inclining to blue. With an audacity unparalleled in the whole history of village schoolmistresses at this date, partly owing no doubt to papa's respectable accumulation of cash, which rendered her profession not altogether one of necessity, she had actually donned a hat and feather, and lowered her hitherto plainly looped up hair, which now fell about her shoulders in a profusion of curls. Poor Dick was astonished. He had never seen her look so distractingly beautiful before, save on Christmas Eve, when her hair was in the same luxuriant condition of freedom. But his first burst of delighted surprise was followed by less comfortable feelings as soon as his brain recovered its power to think. Fancy had blushed. Was it with confusion? She had also involuntarily pressed back her curls. She had not expected him. "Fancy, you didn't know me for a moment in my funeral clothes, did you?" "Good morning, Dick. No, really, I didn't know you for an instant in such a sad suit." He looked again at the gay tresses and hat. "You've never dressed so charming before, dearest." "I like to hear you praise me in that way, Dick," she said, smiling archly. "It is meat and drink to a woman. Do I look nice, really?" "Fie, you know it. Didn't you remember about my going away to-day?" "Well, yes, I did, Dick. But you know I wanted to look well. Forgive me." "Yes, darling, yes, of course, there's nothing to forgive. No, I was only thinking that when we talked on Tuesday and Wednesday and Thursday and Friday about my absence to-day, and I was so sorry for it, you said, Fancy, so were you sorry, and almost cried and said it would be no pleasure to you to be the attraction of the church to-day, since I could not be there." "My dear one, neither will it be so much pleasure to me. But I do take a little delight in my life, I suppose." She pouted. "Apart from mine?" She looked at him with perplexed eyes. "I know you are vexed with me, Dick, and it is because the first Sunday I have curls and a hat and feather since I have been here happens to be the very day you're away and won't be with me. Yes, say it is, for that is it. And you think that all this week I ought to have remembered you wouldn't be here to-day, and not have cared to be better dressed than usual. Yes, you do, Dick, and it is rather unkind." "No, no," said Dick earnestly and simply. "I didn't think so badly of you as that. I only thought that if you had been going away I shouldn't have tried new attractions for the eyes of other people. But then, of course, you and I are different, naturally." "Well, perhaps we are." "Whatever will the vicar say, Fancy?" "I don't fear what he says in the least," she answered proudly. "But he won't say anything of the sort you think. No, no. He can hardly have conscience to, indeed." "Now, come, you say, Dick, that you quite forgive me, for I must go," she said with sudden gaiety, and skipped backwards into the porch. "Come here, sir, say you forgive me, and then you shall kiss me. You never have yet when I have worn curls, you know. Yes, just where you want to so much. Yes, you may." Dick followed her into the inner corner, where he was probably not slow in availing himself of the privilege offered. "Now, that's a treat for you, isn't it?" she continued. "Good-bye, or I shall be late. Come and see me to-morrow. You'll be tired to-night." Thus they parted, and Fancy proceeded to the church. The organ stood on one side of the chancel, close to and under the immediate eye of the vicar when he was in the pulpit, and also in full view of the congregation. Here she sat down for the first time in such a conspicuous position, her seat having previously been in a remote spot in the aisle. "Good heavens, disgraceful! Curls and a hat and feather!" said the daughters of the small gentry, who had either only curly hair without a hat and feather, or a hat and feather without curly hair. "A bonnet for church always," said sober matrons. That Mr. Maybold was conscious of her presence close beside him during the sermon, that he was not at all angry at her development of costume, that he admired her, she perceived. But she did not see that he loved her during the sermon time as he had never loved a woman before, that her proximity was a strange delight to him, and that he gloried in her musical success that morning in a spirit quite beyond a mere cleric's glory at the inauguration of a new order of things. The old choir, with humbled hearts, no longer took their seats in the gallery as heretofore, which was now given up to the school children who were not singers, and a pupil teacher, but was scattered about with their wives in different parts of the church, having nothing to do with conducting the services for almost the first time in their lives. They all felt awkward, out of place, abashed, and inconvenienced by their hands. The tranter had proposed that they should stay away to-day and go nutting, but grandfather William would not hear of such a thing for a moment. "No," he replied reproachfully, and quoted a verse: "Though this has come upon us, let not our hearts be turned back, or our steps go out of the way." So they stood and watched the curls of hair trailing down the back of the successful rival, and the waving of her feather as she swayed her head. After a few timid notes and uncertain touches, her playing became markedly correct, and towards the end full and free. But whether from prejudice or unbiassed judgment, the venerable body of musicians could not help thinking that the simpler notes that they had been wont to bring forth were more in keeping with the simplicity of their old church than the crowded chords and interludes it was her pleasure to produce. End of section 25. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK. Greenwood Tree. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Under the Greenwood Tree by Thomas Hardy, Part 4, Chapter 6. Into Temptation. The day was done, and Fancy was again in the schoolhouse. About 5 o'clock it began to rain, and in rather a dull frame of mind she wandered into the schoolroom for want of something better to do. She was thinking of her lover, Dick Dewy? Not precisely. Of how weary she was of living alone, how unbearable it would be to return to Yalbury under the rule of her strange-tempered stepmother, that it was far better to be married to anybody than do that, that 8 or 9 long months had yet to be lived through ere the wedding could take place. At the side of the room were high windows of Ham Hill stone, upon either sill of which she could sit by first mounting a desk and using it as a footstool. As the evening advanced, here she perched herself, as was her custom on such wet and gloomy occasions, put on a light shawl and bonnet, opened the window, and looked out at the rain. The window overlooked a field called the Grove, and it was the position from which she used to survey the crown of Dick's passing hat in the early days of their acquaintance and meetings. Not a living soul was now visible anywhere. The rain kept all people indoors who were not forced abroad by necessity, and necessity was less importunate on Sundays than during the week. Sitting here and thinking again of her lover, or of the sensation she had created at church that day, well, it is unknown. Thinking and thinking, she saw a dark masculine figure arising into distinctness at the further end of the Grove, a man without an umbrella. Nearer and nearer he came, and she perceived that he was in deep mourning, and then that it was Dick. Yes, in the fondness and foolishness of his young heart, after walking 4 miles in a drizzling rain without overcoat or umbrella, and in face of a remark from his love that he was not to come because he would be tired, he had made it his business to wander this mile out of his way again, from sheer wish of spending 10 minutes in her presence. "Oh, Dick, how wet you are!" she said, as he drew up under the window. "Why, your coat shines as if it had been varnished, and your hat, my goodness, there's a streaming hat!" "Oh, I don't mind, darling," said Dick cheerfully. "Wet never hurts me, though I am rather sorry for my best clothes. However, it couldn't be helped. We lent all the umbrellas to the women. I don't know when I shall get mine back. And look, there's a nasty patch of something just on your shoulder." "Ah, that's japanning. It rubbed off the clamps of poor Jack's coffin when we lowered him from our shoulders upon the bier. I don't care about that, for 'twas the last deed I could do for him, and 'tis hard if you can't afford a coat for an old friend." Fancy put her hand to her mouth for half a minute. Underneath the palm of that little hand there existed for that half minute a little yawn. "Dick, I don't like you to stand there in the wet, and you mustn't sit down. Go home and change your things. Don't stay another minute." "One kiss after coming so far?" he pleaded. "If I can reach, then." He looked rather disappointed at not being invited round to the door. She twisted from her seated position and bent herself downwards, but not even by standing on the plinth was it possible for Dick to get his lips into contact with hers as she held them. By great exertion she might have reached a little lower, but then she would have exposed her head to the rain. "Never mind, Dick, kiss my hand," she said, flinging it down to him. "Now, good-bye." "Good-bye." He walked slowly away, turning and turning again to look at her till he was out of sight. During the retreat she said to herself, almost involuntarily, and still conscious of that morning's triumph, "I like Dick, and I love him, but how plain and sorry a man looks in the rain, with no umbrella, and wet through." As he vanished, she made as if to descend from her seat, but glancing in the other direction she saw another form coming along the same track. It was also that of a man. He too was in black from top to toe, but he carried an umbrella. He drew nearer, and the direction of the rain caused him so to slant his umbrella that from her height above the ground his head was invisible, as she was also to him. He passed in due time directly beneath her, and in looking down upon the exterior of his umbrella her feminine eyes perceived it to be of superior silk, less common at that date than since, and of elegant make. He reached the entrance to the building, and Fancy suddenly lost sight of him. Instead of pursuing the roadway as Dick had done, he had turned sharply round into her own porch. She jumped to the floor, hastily flung off her shawl and bonnet, smoothed and patted her hair till the curls hung in passable condition, and listened. No knock. Nearly a minute passed, and still there was no knock. Then there arose a soft series of raps, no louder than the tapping of a distant woodpecker, and barely distinct enough to reach her ears. She composed herself, and flung open the door. In the porch stood Mr. Maybold. There was a warm flush upon his face, and a bright flash in his eyes, which made him look handsomer than she had ever seen him before. "Good evening, Miss Day." "Good evening, Mr. Maybold," she said, in a strange state of mind. She had noticed, beyond the ardent hue of his face, that his voice had a singular tremor in it, and that his hand shook like an aspen leaf when he laid his umbrella in the corner of the porch. Without another word being spoken by either, he came into the schoolroom, shut the door, and moved close to her. Once inside, the expression of his face was no more discernible by reason of the increasing dusk of evening. "I want to speak to you," he then said, "seriously, on a perhaps unexpected subject, but one which is all the world to me. I don't know what it may be to you, Miss Day." No reply. "Fancy, I have come to ask you if you will be my wife." As a person who had been idly amusing himself with rolling a snowball might start at finding he had set in motion an avalanche, so did Fancy start at these words from the vicar, and in the dead silence which followed them, the breathings of the man and of the woman could be distinctly and separately heard. And there was this difference between them: his respirations gradually grew quieter and less rapid after the enunciation. Hers, from having been low and regular, increased in quickness and force, till she almost panted. "I cannot, Mr. Maybold, I cannot. Don't ask me," she said. "Don't answer in a hurry," he entreated, "and do listen to me. This is no sudden feeling on my part. I have loved you for more than 6 months. Perhaps my late interest in teaching the children here has not been so single-minded as it seemed. You will understand my motive, like me better perhaps for honestly telling you that I have struggled against my emotion continually, because I have thought that it was not well for me to love you. But I resolved to struggle no longer. I have examined the feelings, and the love I bear you is as genuine as that I could bear any woman. I see your great charm, I respect your natural talents, and the refinement they have brought into your nature. They are quite enough, and more than enough for me. They are equal to anything ever required of the mistress of a quiet parsonage house, the place in which I shall pass my days, wherever it may be situated. Oh, Fancy, I have watched you, criticized you even severely, brought my feelings to the light of judgment, and still have found them rational, and such as any man might have expected to be inspired with by a woman like you. So there is nothing hurried, secret, or untoward in my desire to do this. Fancy, will you marry me?" No answer was returned. "Don't refuse, don't," he implored. "It would be foolish of you, I mean cruel. Of course we would not live here, Fancy. I have had for a long time the offer of an exchange of livings with a friend in Yorkshire, but I have hitherto refused on account of my mother. There we would go. Your musical powers shall be still further developed. You shall have whatever pianoforte you like. You shall have anything, Fancy, anything to make you happy. Pony carriage, flowers, birds, pleasant society. Yes, you have enough in you for any society after a few months of travel with me. Will you, Fancy, marry me?" Another pause ensued, varied only by the surging of the rain against the window panes, and then Fancy spoke in a faint and broken voice. "Yes, I will," she said. "God bless you, my own." He advanced quickly and put his arm out to embrace her. She drew back hastily. "No, no, not now," she said in an agitated whisper. "There are things... but the temptation is, oh, too strong, and I can't resist it. I can't tell you now, but I must tell you. Don't, please don't come near me now. I want to think. I can scarcely get myself used to the idea of what I have promised yet." The next minute she turned to a desk, buried her face in her hands, and burst into a hysterical fit of weeping. "Oh, leave me to myself," she sobbed. "Leave me, oh, leave me." "Don't be distressed, don't, dearest." It was with visible difficulty that he restrained himself from approaching her. "You shall tell me at your leisure what it is that grieves you so. I am happy, beyond all measure happy, at having your simple promise." "And do go and leave me now." "But I must not, in justice to you, leave for a minute until you are yourself again." "There then," she said, controlling her emotions and standing up, "I am not disturbed now." He reluctantly moved towards the door. "Good-bye," he murmured tenderly. "I'll come to-morrow about this time." End of section 26. Recording by Rachel Lintern, Bristol, UK.